Welcome to Organizing and Planning Presentations. Today we'll be talking about some best practices to help you improve your presentations. Here are some key concepts I want you to understand as we talk about Chapter 12, Organizations and Outlines in this lecture. By the time we're done with the lecture, you should be able to define ethos, pathos, and logos, name and give examples of all 5 fingers of the 5-finger model of public speaking, discuss some of the organizing principles for a speech, and then identify the different types of transitions. Because this video is a combination of Chapter 12 and 13, I wanted to give you the key concepts from 13 up front too. When we talk about the 5-finger model from Chapter 12, that is a natural opportunity to dive into answering questions 5 through 8 on this slide. Given that, you will see throughout this video that I go between Chapter 12 and 13. So it's nice to know all the concepts I want you to know up front. Your presentation for this class will be a blend between an informative and persuasive speech, and of course this content is on the test, so this will be applied in more than one place. Well, let's get started by talking about organizing and planning presentations. Let's start first with the key term, rhetorical situation. Now, your rhetorical situation is the circumstances in which you give your speech or presentation. You may have also heard this called the rhetorical triangle in one of your rhetoric classes, the purpose, audience, and context of your speech act, or the what, who, and why, sometimes when and how, of your speech, all depending on where you're taking your communication class or what you took in the past. By understanding the rhetorical situation, you can gauge the best ways to reach your listeners and get your points across. By looking at your audience, you shift your attention from an internal focus, you, to an external them, others emphasis. This other orientation is key to your success as an effective speaker. As you prepare your speech, think about their wants. Ask questions like, how can they best understand the topic? What will engage the audience? What will aid retention? So when you're thinking about doing this, you'll want to probably do this in the classic way that we use appeals in public speaking. These terms that we use when we talk about the different types of appeals to the audience are from Aristotle, so this has been around for quite a while, and of course a student of Plato. He lived in the 300s BCE, so these are not new topics. They literally go back thousands of years, and it's actually a wonderful deep dive topic if you have time and want to go and look it up. So the 3 main ingredients of persuasion are cred, heart, and head. So more traditionally referred to as ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is the nature or the credibility of the communicator. The really important part of this concept is that the audience determines a speaker's ethos. Ethos is not something that the speaker has, but something that the audience perceives. It is your perception of a speaker's credibility, intelligence, motives, and this is important because perceptions can vary. So one's ethos can vary from one listener to the next. It could be one week to the next, and again, you're changing what you think is going on. Ethos consists of the perceptions of the speaker's trustworthiness, competence, open-mindedness, and dynamism, which is one of my favorite words in this class. Dynamism is achieving the right balance of enthusiasm and self-control. Each of these impacted by the context and situation in which the speaker is speaking. An example of how the audience perceives ethos and how one speaker can be viewed so differently is if members well, look at political figures. You could have the same politician give the same speech and audience members come out with drastically different perceptions about that speaker's ethos. Well, now you might be thinking, if ethos or credibility is decided on by the audience, what can you do about it? A lot. You can try and establish ethos with your audience by being polished and well practiced, by explaining your expertise or your experience, citing sources verbally, preparing an engaging presentation. And you can build ethos with how you dress. So here in JSOM, when you show up to do a class presentation, there's a general expectation that you'll look pretty put together. Now, you don't want to put on usually a full suit unless maybe you're trying to really wow a finance professor, but generally people don't show up wearing, sweaty exercise clothes. You want to meet the expectations of the situation and the audience. Pathos or heart is appealing to the emotional state of the audience. To help you with remembering this, think about words similar to pathos, ethos, empathy, sympathy. Those words have to do with emotions. The use of pathos or emotional appeals can bring audiences to feel a stronger tie to the issue and bring them to action. However, you must be careful with persuasive speeches that merely rely on pathos. They can backfire if the audience feels like you're trying to manipulate them. Finally, we have logos, which are appeals to your audience based on fact and logic. So this is your message's argument. You build persuasive messages on sound, credible information. And this is influenced on how clear you are with key points and the organization of your argument. A great persuasive speech focuses on all three of these appeals. So what's lacking here? Take a look at this letter to the editor published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Test yourself. So which of these three appeals does this slide use mainly? How do you know? What isn't it using? So what's going on here is you will notice that it has just chest scans. And these are from people with vaping-related lung injuries. It is relying really exclusively on logic. There is no emotional appeal. You maybe might have a sense of some credibility, but not really, because it looks like a journal article. So it just doesn't have enough to really convince a 15-year-old to stop vaping because they see abnormalities on chest imaging. So you want to be careful here when you think about what would move our audience. Well, this journal article would certainly move some people, but it's not going to move others. Well, the next thing that we want to talk about is the 5-finger model. So here's a bit of a dad joke here, but it is a handy way to make sure you know how to build a solid presentation. It represents the 5 main parts of a speech, regardless of how you organize things within each part. So this becomes a really quick template that you can use to set up any presentation. So the parts in order are the attention statement, the introduction, body, conclusion, and the residual message. So take your finger out or your hand out and follow along with me. Your thumb is your attention statement. First finger is the introduction. Middle finger is your body, where you're going to be spending most of your speech time. Conclusion on the ring finger, and finally the residual on your pinky. It's a critical structure that you can use to evaluate your presentation and others. And I'll tell you from having graded and seen a lot of presentations in business school that what happens is people tend to miss the residual message, the conclusion, and the attention statement. They just focus on the body and a little bit of a conclusion and intro. It ends up taking away from the real capacity people have to do an effective presentation. So this is a shortcut that you can use for your other classes. So let's begin with your attention statement, or your attention getter. This is the way you're going to focus the audience's attention on you and your speech. There's a lot of different ways, and your book goes through this too, that you can persuade your audience to be interested in what you're saying. The introduction should introduce you and the topic, establishing a relationship with the audience, and then be really clear on what the topic is so that the audience knows why are they listening. And now there are some times where you don't want to be that clear. Let's say you're delivering bad news, but generally you want to be super specific about what you're trying to do here. The body is going to be where you're having all different types of organizational strategies. So again, inside the book, and we'll talk about it a little in this lecture, will vary. It's the meat of your speech where you're laying out all the details. You're probably spending most of your time here, and this is going to be the biggest section of your presentation. Your conclusion should summarize all the main points and tie them back to the overall topic, and then the residual message or key takeaway would be that idea that stays with the audience after the presentation. It's going to get you to think, as a result of the presentation, what do you want your audience to remember or to do? Well, the next part about here is the introduction and repetition section. So this is another way to think about general speech organization. So that would be the intro, the body, and the conclusion. The other classic way that people will think about this is you tell them what you're going to tell them, you then tell them what you are telling them, and then you tell them what you have told them. So what do they actually remember? What you're trying to tell them. So when you're listening to a speech, it's so different than reading a book or a paper, because you can't reread the speech, right? Good presenters know that, so they're going to repeat their important points in the introduction, body, and conclusion to aid audience retention. The next thing you want to think about is how can we capture their attention? So this is the 5-finger model, first finger, which would be our attention statement. A lot of different ways that you can do this, but the big main idea here is that this has to be related to your topic. And you want to make sure that even if you're using, let's say, we'll pick a shocking statistic or a startling fact, it's not going to be so startling or distracting to your audience that you've lost them. I'll give you a terrible little time that I used a question. So let's say you're doing a presentation about, I don't know, all right, I'm just going to give you a real one that I had in class where I was talking about a short story with a group of students, and in the short story it talked about a drug. And I'm just so out there. I'm like such a humanities professor sometimes, and I said to them, oh, how much does this drug cost? And if you ask a question like that, is really anyone going to raise their hand and be like, oh, indeed, Dr. Moore, this drug costs this much? I mean, no, nobody's going to say that. And I've seen that in JSOM too, where a student group said, hey, show of hands, who feels like they're pretty bad at math? If you did that in the workplace, show of hands, who didn't get their assessment report in on time? Nobody was going to want to out themselves in that way. So you need to think about what's going to be relevant, what's going to get the audience engaged in the presentation, and be really careful with your intention getters that they're going to keep the audience focused on what you're trying to do with that presentation. Oh, and by the way, somebody did come up to me after class and tell me the answer to my terrible question. So just be really careful there. With the introduction, that's the second finger, you want to establish your credibility and get the listeners involved. Who are you? Why are you capable of talking on this topic? One thing to be careful of here is if you're doing a big group presentation and you run through 6 names, let's say it's a big class, is anybody going to remember all 6 names of your team? No. So you need to think about more creative ways to explain who you are and what you're going to be doing. You want to state your thesis pretty clearly, so single sentence, preview those main points. It is really useful to have a slide when you're doing this here in JSOM where you go through, here are the main things that we're talking about in this presentation. For the audience, that provides a map. But for the professor too, it's a much easier way if they're sitting there grading your presentation for them to think, oh, okay, I do know what's happening. And it'll build that professor's confidence as they're sitting there grading. An agenda slide is another really good way to do this, where maybe you say, here's our main idea. First, Jane is going to talk about. Second, Ahmed is going to talk about. Third, Mo is going through. Something like that is a way that you can introduce everybody in your team, build up credibility, but also use that moment to preview the organization of your presentation. All right. The other big thing here, and this is one of my favorite things that I hope you take out of this class, is the idea of primacy and recency. To put it simply, we tend to remember the first things the speaker says, so that's primacy, and the last thing a speaker says, so that's recency, the most recent thing they tend to say. So everything in the middle, like this slide right now, starts to get a little bit hazy because even the best audience has difficulty maintaining 100% attention over a long period of time. Same thing for your audience. And just think about it in a class where if somebody, and this is not my conclusion, but if I were to say in conclusion, and in a classroom, everybody's like, will start perking up just a little bit because they know they're going to get the end and be able to leave. On the flip of that, don't ever say in conclusion if you're not actually concluding. If you actually are only like halfway through, people will be really disappointed. So in the body of the presentation, a couple of other tips here. You want to think about a limited number of main points. Classic in rhetoric is the 3-point strategy. I know some people will be like, well, don't do that. But if you look even at academic books tend to be an intro chapter, 3 body chapters, and then a conclusion chapter. This is just a classic way to do it. But you want to make sure you're using the right number of points for whatever you're trying to get across. If you have 5 minutes to talk and 4 main points, I mean, you only get a minute per point. That's too many main points. So you need to streamline your topic, summarize the main points, and then think about how you're going to get that information organized into some kind of strategy. So that means within the body, you want to think about strategically picking your pattern of organization. In your book in table 12.6, there is a number that you can go through. You want to be strategic about what you're picking, thinking about enhancing the chance that you'll elicit audience response. So strategies work like for some speeches, others don't, and then you want to think about what works best for the content that you are covering. You'll want to think about symmetry. So that's advancing the main ideas of your speech in a balanced way. Give each one the emphasis it deserves. You'll think about the number of ideas. You have too many, there's no way to develop them all, so they need to be narrowed down. In a group presentation, and I'm going to probably repeat this, you'll want to think maybe about doing a really rough outline, even if it's just bullet points, so that you understand what is going where. And then this connects back to that placement of ideas, primacy, and recency. Most important stuff, sort of hitting it at the beginning so they know what's happening. Maybe your weaker content is right in the middle. In a group presentation, if you had somebody, and of course hopefully this will never happen, but it will, somebody who's least prepared, that person goes right in the middle so that you're starting and ending really strong, leading and concluding with information and ideas that are crucial to whatever case you're making. You may also want to think about transitions as connectives. So thinking about how we bridge one idea to the other. So if you look at this bridge, think of each column as an idea or a main point in your speech. The archways are the transitions that connect all the ideas together. Transitions keep the audience on track, so there's my train pun, and give flow to the speech. So transitions can help you do all the following. They can alert listeners to new ideas. This slide that you're looking at right now would be considered a transition style slide because it tells the audience, hey, we're shifting to something new. And then you might say, next, Dr. Moore, let's say I'm passing it to another professor. Next, Dr. Lookadoo is going to talk about the types of transitions. We are sort of signaling to the audience what's happening, reminding them of somebody's name, and creating this miniature preview of points. It's a really great way to make the audience feel like there's a logical order to your presentation. So there's a couple of different types of transitions that I'm going to emphasize. I'll just point out there are 13 other transitions that are in the book. These are really the ones that are most common. So signposting, first we're talking about, second we're talking about, got this on the next slide, first, second, third, argument 1, 2, 3, my first reason, my second reason, things like that will help the audience stay focused on what you're talking about. And then you can also signal what's most important. One caution there, be really careful if you say we have 3 main points and then you go through 1 and 2, but you kind of forget to say third. People will definitely catch you on that, so just be careful. Internal previews, wonderful. So this is second internal preview, so they can use a signpost transition to move to it. So second internal previews, it is to tell them what you're going to tell them in miniature. They look and sound like a mini introduction. It's a really good time to reference what other people's names are, to talk about what's going to happen next. Internal summaries are really similar. So this third type of transition, so use the word third there, signposting, are similar to previews, but they come after you presented the information. So I might say, now that I am done talking about internal summaries, I'm going to move on to rhetorical questions that you can use to guide your presentation. More developed speeches, longer speeches, tend to use previews and summaries to remind the audience of what's been covered, what's to come. Here is one other really great hint. If you have one person on your team who is a master presenter, that person could be the one to do all the summaries and the previews and be tracking the time of your presentation so they can summarize, preview, move the person on to the next one, and keep your presentation on track with time. Some JSOM classes will have pretty heavy penalties if you go over or under time. So having that person do that reminds the audience of what you're telling them and keeps you on track. So finally, or fourth, we have rhetorical questions. These are really classic. You can use them to highlight movement, assist the flow of your presentation. Just do not distract your audience. You also might figure out in a class that maybe you have that student who's always answering rhetorical questions. Like you might not want to, and it happens in the workplace too, you might not want to use a rhetorical question like who's ready for the meeting to begin. I don't really want anybody to say whether or not they're ready for the meeting to begin at work. I just want the meeting to begin. So I might not use a rhetorical question there. I might just say, okay, now we're starting the meeting and here are the 3 things we're going to cover. But rhetorical questions can work, especially if you're doing something somewhat persuasive. All right. So we've covered presentation transitions, we've talked about the five-finger model, and then here is the next thing I want to talk about with the body before I go to the conclusion in the residual message. So we're still on finger 3, which is the body. All right, so this is citing in a speech. You need to. This will be different, and you will want to try and have these down pretty well. If you're allowed to use a note card in a class, this is where you'd want to use it. If you want to be really impressive, memorize them. And think about saying these aloud naturally, like you were talking and introducing somebody. So according to a recent research study on citing in speeches, the authors say blah, blah, blah. It just sounds much more conversational. Now, if I said instead, according to the article, title, published in blah, 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 it just doesn't sound natural, right? Well, besides the fact I'm saying blah, blah, blah. It sounds much more natural if I say, Brown, in an article in the New York Times, wrote blah, blah, blah. It just sounds a lot better. All right, so here is our second to last finger of the five-finger model. So the conclusion, we're into our fourth and fifth fingers on our hand. So in the conclusion, you're going to summarize the presentation's thesis. That's going to be a single sentence. Tell them what you told them. Next, you're going to review the main points. You're going to leave the audience with a specific noteworthy takeaway. So use your residual message, which is your pinky finger. And you'll include some kind of statement or closing thought that indicates you're finished. I've seen way too many decent presentations flail and plummet when it comes to the last speaker. They're supposed to be talking and they get to the end and they say, oh, thanks. I literally have seen teams in JSOM where they get to that moment where they should be concluding and instead they kind of like at their main point. And I literally at one time had a team walk out of the room and not come back. I'm like, where did they go? And we're all like, was that it? Or are they coming back to do a song and dance? But no, that was it. And I've seen this over and over where people have amazing, strong presentations and they get to the conclusion and it just falls apart. So you think about how the brain loves symmetry, order, coming back to what you referenced in the intro. That's a way to give them symmetry and make it satisfying for the audience. Different types of speeches conclude differently. A key difference between an informative and a persuasive speech is that persuasive tends to have some kind of call of action. So if you're going to be talking about different ways to solve an issue, persuade them to act on that information. Don't just share it. All right. So in section 3, I want to mention a few things to consider when developing a presentation or your message. Previously, I had touched on the idea that informative persuasive speeches conclude differently. We're going to dive into the differences between these speech types in terms of purpose. So with informative, there's 4 potential purposes. Sharing ideas with the audience, increasing audience understanding, changing audience perceptions, or helping the audience gain new skills. As a speaker, you're going to incorporate your point of view, but it doesn't necessarily have your attitude or your interpretation. You're saving that for a persuasive speech. Now, persuasive speeches are intended to move the audience, so that's why they'll have some kind of appeal, more likely to emotion, that pathos. A speaker is going to use a persuasive speech to try to motivate the audience, to take some kind of action, to change the audience's understanding. And this in business could be routine. It could be that you're just trying to convince somebody to upgrade the wiring for the network. It may be, and would you have an emotional appeal there? Like, would an emotional appeal work if you're upgrading wiring in an accounting office? No, nobody cares how they feel, right? This is our accounting office. They just get the work done. So it can be persuasive, but then still you have to craft it back to think about how can I shift understanding and attitude for that audience. And so it is a little bit more complicated than just doing a speech to inform. All right, now there's 4 types of presentations to inform that you'll need to know. So it is an explanation, a report, a description, and some kind of demonstration of how to do things. So you might need to present a descriptive speech where you need to draw your audience in with vivid language or get them excited about something. You might need to just demonstrate how a process works. Here's how you access this. Here's how you update the flow chart for our organization. And these different types of speeches require different focus on details, organization, and on writing. So we've already talked in general about this key consideration where you're crafting your presentation for your audience. So here's a couple of audience-related items that could have an impact on your presentation. First off, knowledge. How much do they know about the topic? Let's say you're talking about literacy and your audience has no idea what literacy rates are in the area. I mean, if you think about it another way, if you ever listen to someone talk about something that you know a lot about and they got their information wrong, or maybe you had a rhetoric class, AP Rhet in high school, and they pronounced ethos as ethos or ethos as ethos, and you're listening to me talk and be like, why is she such a Southerner pronouncing it in that way? Because, and I'll just say it's because I took a weird Greek class in college. So there's just ways that you're going to need to think about different points of view than when you say things and how somebody might like your presentation, and think about the background knowledge, the attitudes of your audience. Next, you have framing. Everything we do involves framing. So when we tell a story, we place an imaginary set of boundaries like a frame around that story. So there's things we emphasize and things we leave out. What's included and what is omitted is going to be framing. Now, your book talks about gatekeeping and agenda setting. I feel like gatekeeping sort of a negative word. But let's pull that back out of your sort of way that you've heard that word before and think about this as a mass communication concept that talks about how the mass media serves as gatekeepers of information. So the gatekeeper decided what news, information, or entertainment reaches the audience in a presentation, and the speaker is serving as the gatekeeper. They're determining what research is presented and not presented. I can tell you when I worked out of college as a reporter in a newspaper, I had the most easy beat. I was the education reporter. So all the principals would be like, hey, Sarah, the time was before I had my Ph.D., will you come to our school and report on this author visit or this cool thing that our students are doing for art? And I had to pick, right? I can't go and do all of it. So this gatekeeping can be really negative, but it can just be that, well, we have to think about what to focus on. And for me, maybe one day I pick the author visit and another day I'm picking the art display. So it's who decides what's that number one story. We know with the serial position effect, the audience remembers what comes first and last. And so that order and that agenda is important just as much as including what is and is not in there. So in other words, when I'm coming around here, you're going to be gatekeeping when you present information here in JSOM. You can't be completely objective. You're going to have a bias or a lens you see the world through, and you're going to be framing your message influenced by culture. So consider culture you and your audience come from and how culture is going to impact that viewpoints. And that culture isn't necessarily region or ethnic background, it's subcultures. So Silicon Valley has a different culture from Wall Street. A small accounting firm is really different than Big Four. Here in JSOM, accounting is going to be really different from finance. So you need to start to think about corporate culture, company culture, subgroup culture, department culture, and how that's going to influence their values and their interests. Culture, in short, impacts framing. All right, the next part of this is that you'll be thinking about audience centeredness. I think we'll go through there. So you'll be thinking about how an audience's prior knowledge influences the outcome of the speech. You're thinking about how you're framing your presentation, and then you're thinking about how the format of your presentation affects your audience's response. And so that's a couple of different things. We've talked about a lot of this already, but you'll be thinking about visual aids. We know people retain better with a visual. And in fact, this slide is not a good slide, and I will tell you why, because we know that people tend to remember information better when there's a picture on there. So the reason I don't have a picture is because I know I've chosen this channel video, and I'm taking this video, and I'm going to put it on YouTube as well as stream, which means I can't just use any old image. I have to have images that I'm legally allowed to use. So I don't have as many images in these slides as I'd normally like to have. So this changes probably retention. That means you're less likely to retain the information off of the slide than you would be if I had had a picture, let's say, of a gate or a frame, or maybe people who are looking happy because the presentation really meets their needs. So couple of other things there with visual aids. It can be expensive to do a presentation in person, but all of this is changing because of now we're doing so many presentations online. All right, so this was a long one. We're back now with our review to our lecture notes. So we talked about the idea of ethos, logos, pathos. So it's the classic rhetoric strategy. I want you to memorize that 5-finger model. Make your life so much easier later. Every single time you do a presentation in JSOM, you should just do those 5 things first and then organize within it. Organizing within it, go look at chapter 12 or section 12.6 in the book. I'm not going to test on all of those. It's a crazy list of, I mean, it's a really great list, but it's a lot. So I'll be focusing on the key ones. We'll be talking about or on the test, you'll have to know the different types of transitions. You'll want to know the difference between informative and persuasive. We talked about interpretation and bias. You might think even more based on what we talked about here initially of how you can present a neutral speech. Know the different categories of informative speeches. So we talked in this lecture about the main 4. We talked about the idea of framing, the different forms of it, and we talked about some of the concepts that go into introductions, conclusions, and the really important thing here, the serial position effect, which that's primacy. Started off with the lecture notes, recency. I'm ending with the lecture notes because what do I really want you to remember out of here? Well, I'm telling you. So this was another way that I tried to set the agenda and be really clear about how you're going to use this. So that is my big picture wrap up, all about organizing your presentation, planning them out, and the other thing that will make this more complicated as you go through on JSOM is that you'll be doing this with a group of people for a lot of your classes. So if you can get down now, here is my 5-finger model. Here is how we're going to rough outline our presentation. Here's how we then can organize that body. You will find that your presentations are going to be much easier to do later on when you have this initial template that you can then modify for virtually any type of presentation. So good luck. I'll guarantee you it's not just this class you're going to need this on. JSOM loves their group presentations, so get comfortable with it now. The more you can get this down and get some tricks for making it easy, the better and smoother those team projects are going to go later.